Hi, everyone. This week we're going to talk about Gonnerman's book detailing the life and the events around Elaine Bartlett's arrest and subsequent parole after many, many years for her delivery of 4 ounces of cocaine to some undercover officers in Albany, New York in 1983. Specifically, we want to begin to look at how the policies that we develop in the CJ system sabotages the ability of people to succeed. And these are policies that occur pre-arrest and during the arrest and post-arrest. So let's talk about Elaine's case a little bit, and let's talk about it in relation to how people are arrested, what happens when they're arrested, who's more likely to be arrested, and who gets incarcerated. There has been a long-standing argument in sociology and criminology that we have used the criminal justice system for controlling Blacks and Hispanics. We'll look a little bit at the data, and I'll be asking you to consider whether or not that's true. We're moving on from the Santos book, where I hope you got a pretty good idea of what his experience in prison as a young white man was, and contrast that with the experience of Gonnerman, who went to prison as a young Black female. In both cases of Santos and Gonnerman, we see the effects of the war on drugs. You, of course, were not alive during the time of the war on drugs, though I would argue we haven't quite left it behind yet. But there was a concerted effort in the 1980s to target drug offenders and drug offenses. And they used all of the resources available of the federal government, of the state, and local police to target people, especially who were dealing drugs, but also people who were using drugs. And we saw an exponential growth in our prison population during that time as a result of these arrests. If we look at the race of the population in the United States currently, we see that about 18% of the population is Black, and about 82% is non-Black. So the majority of people in the country are not Black. If we look at the drug-using population by race and contrast that to the overall population, you see that Blacks actually constitute less drug-using population than non-Blacks do. So they constitute 18% of the overall population. But when you look at who among them uses drugs, only 12% of our population using drugs is Black. If we look at drug arrests by race, however, you begin to see that even though 12% of the people using drugs are Black, 38% of the arrests for drugs are among Blacks. So think about that for just a second. They have a 3 times higher arrest rate for use than non-Blacks do in our society. If we look at the proportion of drug users who are sent to prison, we see that 6% of non-Blacks are sent to prison. So 6% of non-Blacks get sent to prison, whereas 59% of Blacks who get convicted of drug offenses are sent to prison. This is almost 10 times higher for Blacks than it is for whites. If we look at the role of gender in drug abuse, okay, and remember in the case of Elaine Bartlett, she was not a drug user. She took that 4 ounces to Albany to sell it to try to get money to fund a Thanksgiving dinner. Also remember that 4 ounces, for those of you not familiar with cocaine, 4 ounces is about, if you took 4 dice and put them in your hand, in the palm of your hand, that is about 4 ounces of cocaine. Okay, so it's not very much. It's a very, very small amount when you consider who's actually drug dealing. Also be mindful that Elaine was set up by a friend of a coworker who went by Charlie, who was really George Dietz. And George was trying to get his own butt out of a sling after he himself had been arrested for dealing drugs. When you combine that with the fact that Troop G in New York just needed an arrest to try to keep their funding going, so the purity didn't matter, the way in which the drug arrest was made didn't matter. It was just a matter of having a, quote, big bust, end quote, that they could present to say that they ought to be able to stay in business. So she delivers this 4 ounces of cocaine to Albany, New York, really to undercover cops, Ken and Sue, which she should have been suspicious right then. That speaks to her naivete. And as a result, she gets popped for that. And Nathan also gets popped, her boyfriend, who decides to ride along to Albany from Harlem. And in getting popped for that, Nathan also was under arrest. Nathan subsequently took a plea, as you see, and came out on the better side of that. Elaine would not take a plea because she did not believe that what she had done was she was accused of doing, which was trafficking drugs. And in her failure to take a plea, she ended up getting 20 years to life. Nathan also got 20 years to life, but only served a few years before he was let out on parole. And the fact is that people who take pleas are treated more kindly and gently in the system than those who challenge the system by not taking the pleas. But remember that she had no trust in the system or her lawyers. Remember that her lawyers, who were public defenders, remember that they called no witnesses on her behalf, and that the jury was only out 40 minutes in deciding her case. In this slide, you see the role of gender in drug abuse, and very clearly what you can see is that for those people aged 18 or over, males abuse drugs at twice the rate of females. So that's that bar chart on the right there. It's about equal during the teenage years. Okay. And age 18 or older, as I said before, is almost double for males. Okay, so what impact does this have on what happens to women when they are convicted? This slide shows you where women are locked up in the United States relative to being in jail, state prisons, and federal prisons. And it also shows you where youth are also detained. And right now we have about 4,600 youth, a little over that actually, detained in the United States. So look at all the women sitting in local jails, of which 50,000 of them have not even been convicted yet. So most of the women in jail are there as part of a pretrial detention. Okay, that means that they have not been convicted of their offense yet, and that the majority of those are in for property offenses. Third-time fraud, stealing from Walmart or Kohl's, something like that for a third time. Very few are actually involved in public order offenses, only about 9,000, and just a couple more are involved, 13,000 are involved in violent offenses. Then you see that we have 99,000 women incarcerated in the United States in state prisons, and another 14,000 incarcerated in prisons that the federal government runs. So females commit fewer crimes than males do, other than for prostitution. And this is true for all racial and ethnic groups. In addition, if you look at the rate of serious crimes for women, they're even less than they are for other types of crimes like property crimes. Females comprise 26.2, or about a quarter of all arrests, whereas males constitute the other 3/4. When you look at why Elaine was incarcerated, you should be able to identify in your readings at least 3 or 4 factors that affected her incarceration, that is, her conviction and her incarceration. And you remember that, and I think you'll remember, you may have missed it, but in your reading, when they do you'll see that when they did Elaine's pre-sentence investigation, that she was not given a copy of that pre-sentence investigation, and parts of it were read to her at the time of her sentencing. And in her pre-sentence investigation, the probation officer who wrote that up wrote that Elaine had said that she deals in coke. Elaine argued with this vehemently because, of course, she never said that, and prior to this time had no history of dealing in drugs. And yet that still went in the pre-sentence investigation, or the PSI report. And as a result, the judge considered that when he sentenced her to 20 years to life. One of the factors you should identify is the effect of poverty. Elaine had a public defender, and in fact, most violent and drug offenders are represented by public defenders. You see 88% in state courts and 66% in federal courts. When you look at who is in prison, what you can see is that our prison population is dominated by non-blacks. That is, if you look at males, there are 1,255,300, or 60% of the people, the males incarcerated, are non-black. That means they're Hispanic or white. For females, there's 136,000, or almost twice as many non-black or white Hispanic as there are black people, black women incarcerated. And if you look at the totals, we have almost 1 million blacks incarcerated, or 39.4% of those incarcerated are black. Compare that again to the fact that only 18% of the population is black. If you look at the prison population from 1970 to 2005, it grew by almost 800%. Women's incarceration rates increased a full 800% over the past 30 years, which includes that period when there was a war on drugs. White females comprise almost 50% of the prison population, in comparison to black females, who account for about 22% of the population. People of color, including blacks and Hispanics, make up about 30% of the population, but account for 60% of those people imprisoned. Looking at this other slide, you'll see a similar pattern. So make sure you look at these questions at the end.